This will be given by Ms. Jo Van Yu, the Managing Director and CEO of APAC-TWNIC, and she will be sharing the topic of the Internet governance in Taiwan, where we stand today. So now, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let's put our hands together to welcome Ms. Jo Van Yu, please.
Okay. So thank you. I'm Jo Van Yu, CEO of APAC-TWNIC. Good morning and welcome, everyone. So thank you for Bernard's inspiring sharing. So I think it's general when we discuss Internet governance. We discuss the Internet governance at the international level. So we discuss about the Internet of international, the governance of international institutions and how to build the norms, through the participation of multi-stakeholders globally. And so we can see, just as Bernard mentioned, that in 2003, we have a WSIS, and now then we have WGIG. And then in 2014, we have NMUJA, this statement. And later, we have also IGF, it's a WSIS at plus 10. So this year, last year we saw the WSIS plus 10. And this year, we will see the net MUJO plus 10. So we can see a lot of discussion at the international level, but we can also know, everyone here, that the challenges do not exist at the international level, but we also see in the domestic level as well. As Bernard mentioned, international institutions are stuck. But we also here, everyone, we can also know that it's also a lot of challenges in the domestic levels, the governments and also the local stakeholders. We all find it really difficult to face the challenges in each country. So today, I would like to share the internet governance in Taiwan and also where we stand today. Okay, so because today the audience are mainly speaking Mandarin, so I will switch to the Mandarin.
Thank you very much. So as you can see, well, in the past 10 years or so, what has happened in Taiwan? Before 2010, we saw that Internet really crossed paths with our daily, for example, in our discussion, we talked about spam or e-commerce, but it did not feature prominently in our public discussion. With regards to the Internet, you may still remember that back in 2012, we had a famous incidents which generated a lot of discussion on the Internet because the government hoped that the App Store actually should be requested to implement a trial period. So Google Play Store was shut down effectively. And in 2013, you may still remember that Taiwan's IPO, or TPO, drafted a regulation, hoping that with government's order, it can effectively block the sites of overseas Internet users if they infringe on certain rights. So we can block the IP address and start providing DNS service to some of offshore websites. But at the same time, that generated a lot of public backlash. Also in 2014, in Taiwan, we saw the Sunflower movement taking place, giving rise to the development, the popularity of social media. And in 2017, we had a lot of discussion on the impact of Facebook and other peers to create the effect of echo chambers, so to speak. We also see the emergence of discussion surrounding mis or disinformation. So in 2018, in Taiwan, we seem to see a new model being developed, that is NGO and other relevant stakeholders started to establish fact-checking models or mechanisms to deal with misinformation. Meanwhile, cybersecurity also came to the fore. We saw Taiwan's first cybersecurity law was being drafted. And further down the road, we saw a lot of content-related issues being discussed in Taiwan society. For example, we had this OTT Act. For example, how to this draft of the OTT Act, actually it was being proposed by the government, hoping that we can use site blocking to stop the provision of certain illegal services, for example, from mainland China on the internet. And later, the government wanted to address a lot of cyber crime, so it proposed the Technology Investigation Act, hoping to give powers to LEAs or law enforcement agencies to actually get into the terminal devices to access some client information for supervision purposes. Of course, these regulations have generated a lot of public debate. And in 2022, that is 2 years ago, we saw the proposal of the Digital Intermediary Services Act, which also generated heated debate. We were discussing, do we need something like a European version that is a strong iron fist approach to regulate the digital sphere? Should we regulate digital content in such a iron fist manner? And last year, we still very well remember that we were discussing how to deal with fraud, how to combat fraud, and the discussion continued into this year even. And it's another forum of discussion. The government has been discussing whether we should have a AI Basic Act to govern AI-related content or models. There are also protection law related to the protection of child and adolescents. It also takes a huge part in Taiwan's internet government because the government took the lead in successfully establishing a law to restrict the access to illicit content with regards to child and adolescents on the internet. So we saw that in the past 10 years, we started from something simple, with the discussion starting from the e-commerce space, but now we can focus on different areas like content, child and adolescent issues, misinformation, and fraud. But also in the same period, the government of Taiwan also plays its due role. It wants to intervene more and more, and we see more regulations being established in response. But at the same time, as a member of the community, we probably have heard this IGF, Internet Governance Forum. Back in 2015, we have a local edition of the IGF. And over the years, we discussed many, many issues with a great diversity. In the beginning, we discussed a lot of privacy issues. Later, we discussed about digital transformation. And now, we discuss mainly about AI-related issues. So within this local community, we have these fruitful discussions about the impact of internet on Taiwan's society at large. So in the past 10 years, we've seen this increasingly complex landscape with more and more challenges facing us. So in Taiwan, we have been thinking about how can we respond to these new realities. Early on, actually, I can share this example back in the days with you. We see a lot of self-regulation models being proposed. TWNIC was actually one of the self-regulatory models. We were one of the proposers or advocates for self-regulations. Back in 2018, for example, we focused on piracy issues or pirated products. We hoped that we can work with rights holders and ISPs, and we can leverage the TWNIC platforms to bring them together on board to deal with online piracy issues. For example, we can have this pre-process mediation meeting, also a panel review process with a panel of experts. We hope to forge a consensus with different parties so that in this process, we can effectively respond to online piracy issues. For example, we can disable some of the DNS services to respond to piracy challenges. But unfortunately, we did not successfully reach a consensus in the community. So very sadly, we had to bring this project to a halt. Later on, as we see more and more fraud cases happening in Taiwan, along with other criminal typologies, we actually started to pivot our attention to focus more on PPP, private-public partnership. For example, when facing fraud, the government started to work with the private sector in a platform-based approach. The government, for example, actually invited multiple agencies and ministries, as you can see on the left-hand side. For example, this Criminal Investigation Bureau of our Ministry of Interior and also our Ministry of Justice actually provided some of the confidential intelligence. And also the National Communication provides a communication platform, and Ministry of Digital Affairs provides a digital consultancy or digital development support. With this joint platform combining multiple sectors, we could potentially combat fraud and also block fraudsters outside of Taiwan. So this platform, or this PPP model, has been extensively adopted as we respond to fraud early on in the food chain. Moreover, just this month, I think you see a lot of media exposure about incidents related to NCII, or non-consensual intimate image, being spread rapidly on the internet, especially with regard to young and adolescents. So a new PPP model has emerged to deal with NCII issues. So after the protection law of child and adolescents are being passed, now an NCII center has been established, serving as an intermediary. It can receive user complaints or use victim reports before validating some of the content. And at the same time, it can also reach out to website operators, platform providers, or ISPs to deal with or to take down some of the illicit images online without delay to prevent harm. Also, NCI also work with the Ministry of Health and Welfare and Department of Health in each cities and counties to leverage the powers of regulation to deal with major breach of NCII regulations that could not otherwise be prevented by the NCII Center alone. And this one is also familiar to all of you because TWNIC also is running a pilot or experimental model in-house. So, for example, if we receive a court ruling or an executive order from government agencies, we can actually leverage the powers of technology. So we can more immediately respond to some of the challenges brought about by the internet. Meanwhile, if in the case of major breaches of laws or regulations, we are thinking whether we can more actively respond to such instances with our mechanisms. So now what we are trying to do is to streamline or make the process more transparent. For example, are we able to share or process a larger amounts of information so that we can notify or inform the community or the society at large to see if this process is acceptable or not. We can also establish this appeal mechanism for different stakeholders to increase the transparency of the process.
整个的这样子的一个社群的一个回应，在 Internet 带来。
So, in other words, the Internet community is facing a lot of challenges. Basically, in Taiwan, we hope that we can create innovative models. What we want to achieve is to make sure that we will be ahead of the laws and regulations. By promoting public-private partnership, we will be able to deal with issues such as fraud. And especially if there's a legal framework that has been put in place, sometimes it's very difficult to implement laws and regulations. If that's the case, then, for example, with regard to piracy issues, we probably can take the lead ahead of the government. So for the internet community of Taiwan, what we want to do is that whenever there is ambiguity regarding laws and regulations, probably there are things the internet community can do. That's why we have already created some public-private partnership. We have created some models in order to deal with major issues. So whether we talk about laws and regulations, we know that government are enacting a lot of legislation. Back in 2013, we were still discussing piracy website. Back then, there were a lot of pushbacks. And then in 2018 or around 2018, 2019, we began to talk about Digital Intermediary Service Act, Technology Investigation Act. Again, those laws and regulations have given rise to a lot of suspicion among the civil society. But now we have a very successful piece of legislation in order to crack down on illegal advertisement, or we want to protect the welfare of children and adolescents by taking down some infringing website. Obviously, when it comes to legislation, I need to mention the role played by the court system. How do we deal with content management on the internet? Obviously, our government is trying to enact some legislation. The government sometimes also come up with executive orders in order to deal with these issues. Over the past decade, the internet community of Taiwan is trying to implement self-regulation. We tried to implement public-private partnership. At the same time, the government is also enacting a lot of laws and regulations. So a lot of things are coming together in order to make sure we have a better governance framework. As mentioned by Bertrand in his speech, we know that internet has become part of our daily life. So we are using the internet more and more. This obviously will create even more challenges going forward. Therefore, what kind of governance model we want to put in place? What type of digital society we want to build eventually? Obviously, we need to have good digital governance policies. We talk about multi-stakeholder approach. Is this the answer? Is this the holy grail for the internet community? Well, for me personally, I believe that multi-stakeholder is a right approach, because over the past decade, every time there is any legislation discussion relating to internet, people typically get very suspicious. Therefore, it's high time that we forge a consensus first. So we really need to have the participation of multi-stakeholders. That's point number one. Point number two, given the specific nature of the internet, as mentioned by other speakers as well, because this is a cross-border network, and people are paying a lot of attention to issues such as sovereignty. However, because the internet cuts across many national borders, then what kind of policies should we put in place so that we can actually enforce sovereignty, but at the same time to make sure the successful operation of the internet. Last year, this year, a lot of discussion have been focused on AI. So what do we mean by AI-enabled governance? You probably get different answers if you ask different people. That's why, again, multi-stakeholder approach is probably a better choice. In Taiwan, we see that some people are advocating for more legislation, more intervention by the government. If we are to adopt a multi-stakeholder approach, this is someone we hope will come to pass because we believe this is a better approach. So what do we mean by multi-stakeholder approach? Obviously, we throw these terms around a lot, but what do we actually mean by these terms? As mentioned just now, here in Taiwan, we have experimented with many different PPP models. PPP models actually is a multi-stakeholder approach. Obviously, there could be many different PPP models. However, when we talk about multi-stakeholder approach, basically what we want to do is to make sure that we can participate in the governance of the internet. That's why we need to cooperate with the government, and that's why we have PPP models. So, in our efforts, we need to make sure we cover everyone that will be affected by the internet. But although we talk about PPP, but we very seldom discuss the role played by citizens, the role played by civil society. And at the same time, we tend to ignore the importance of transparency. Because if we want to promote collaboration between the government and private sector, transparent is extremely important. I often ask myself this following question. When we talk about multi-stakeholder approach, what is its relationship with law? Can multi-stakeholder approach replace laws and regulations? And what's the correlation between the two? Therefore, in order to adopt multi-stakeholder approach, let's understand this is not a new term. This is not a new concept. As a matter of fact, traditionally, there was always this space where we can include the opinions of many different multi-stakeholders. For example, when government organizes public hearings, that would be a very good example of multiple stakeholders are getting involved. So this is not necessarily a new term. This is not necessarily a new concept. But by multi-stakeholder, we mean this particular process, this mechanism where many people will come together to engage in discussion in order to create consensus. And that's how norms can be created. Once a norm is created, it doesn't need to be translated into a law per se. Probably we can go through, for example, industry self-regulation, would be a good choice. But if we want to make sure it's mandatory, then it needs to be a law so that the government can make sure it will be implemented and enforced. So multi-stakeholder is totally different from law. And here in Taiwan, we often see many different manifestations of this concept. For example, the internet is constantly changing. It's so difficult to enact effective legislation. So should we use multi-stakeholder approach to replace law? Well, to a certain degree, this is probably a correct view, because with lack of consensus, it's very difficult to enact effective legislation. But we still need to create some norms upon which we can engage in collaboration. So probably multi-stakeholder will be the answer. But to flip this issue, because we don't really have a social consensus, therefore we cannot presume everybody would be agreeing to this type of approach. Again, this probably is a contradiction in term. We want to create multi-stakeholder, but we presume that that's everybody's choice. So this is contradiction in terms. And also, once a piece of legislation is enacted, then we need to probably make sure the law will be effectively enforced. And that's not something multi-stakeholder approach can provide any assistance, because it takes government authority in order to be able to enforce a piece of legislation. So when it comes to digital policies, multi-stakeholder approach is believed to be a good approach, but exactly what needs to be in the approach? Well, if you ask me, I do have my own views about this. First of all, step number one, we need to make sure we need to identify the right stakeholders. Because we know that with different issues, there will be different stakeholder communities involved. Therefore, with regard to a specific issue, we need to identify the right stakeholders. We need to include the right stakeholders. We need to make sure we are talking to the right people. So right now, in the internet community, we believe that civil society tends to be ignored up until now. But there are still users of the internet. So once we have identified stakeholders, how representative are they? As mentioned by our first speaker, we know that there are so many different users in the internet, and who have been given the right kind of representation. That's something that's very difficult, but that's something we need to deal with. And also, we also need to make sure there will be meaningful participation by the right stakeholders. We need to make available enough resources. We need to provide sufficient information. And then along the process, we need to make sure everything we do will be very inclusive in nature so that we can include more voices from different people. Step number 4, again, along the process, when we engage in discussions, we need to make sure the discussions will be very transparent. Finally, once we have put a mechanism in place, we need to make sure this mechanism is neutral, it's trustworthy, it's trusted by everyone in the community.
说今天我
So I think we have a lot of opportunities lying ahead of us because our local community is very willing to embrace or experiment with new models in order to effectively respond to some of the challenges brought about by the internet. So for example, in TWIGF, we have some fruitful discussions on different PPP experiments or PPP models. At the same time, we also see that the more active role of the government, the increasing understanding or recognition by the government of the multi-stakeholder model. The government has started to recognize the benefits afforded by the model. But at the same time, closer to home in Taiwan, we see that top-down legislations have come in greater numbers, especially from last year. We see more and more intense regulations coming into being. So in Taiwanese society at large, we haven't been able to exactly pin down the scale and magnitude of the impact of the internet in Taiwanese society. So now in Taiwan, we have to think ahead into the next 20 years. How can we effectively respond to challenges brought about by the internet? For example, based on where we stand right now, we can think about what are some of the feasible mechanisms or processes. I think this is some of our key priorities on the agenda. And to respond to our first keynote speaker, we need to ask ourselves what kind of digital society that we want to create. This is something that should be on the minds of every one of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Yu, for sharing us such an insightful information. Okay, so again, we are now open for Q&A.
Let's see if we have any questions and comments from the floor for Ms. Yu regarding this topic.
你好，我今天用
Hello. I want to raise the question in my different role. I'm representing the International Trademark Association and Digital Asia. It's a committee. So I want to raise this question in this specific capacity. The first comment is that the ITA actually has focused a lot on intermediary liability. In particular, the ITA would like to want to discuss the issue more with Taiwan. This is one of our quarterly priorities. We hope that in the future we can engage with you more by sharing more best practices with Taiwan. In addition, I can really identify with one of the points that you mentioned. That is the multi-stakeholder model. Actually, we need to deal with one key challenges. That is, we need to identify the right stakeholders that we need to reach out to. I also talked about this. For example, if ICANN really want to respond to DNS abuse, some of the stakeholders are not included. For example, cybersecurity hosting providers, they are not included under the remit of the ICANN. So my question for you is that, for example, in Taiwan, if we want to effectively combat fraud or phishing attacks, who are the right stakeholders that should be included in our processes? Thank you very much. Yeah, should I respond to that question? Yes, please.
谢谢。
Thank you very much for the question. I think, I would like to thank you for the comment. I think we, as well as other international partners, are really willing to engage in information exchange and discussions. And secondly, let's take fraud. We talked about different multi-stakeholder approaches, and in the beginning, we saw that ICANN and other international institutions starting to play an important role. But when it comes to domestic discussions, sometimes we have to adopt a different approach, because in ICANN, they discuss concrete solutions with the stakeholders being involved. But domestically, when it comes to discussing fraud, what frauds are we talking about? What kind of fraud typologies are we talking about that will have an impact on whom or which stakeholders we shall include in our processes? So we need to be exact on in what scenario are we dealing with what questions and who are being impacted. For example, fraud. Take fraud, for example. We may be talking about financial fraud. And if we're talking about financial fraud, we need to include FIs or financial institutions or platform, online website or platform providers, or even ISP or even TWNIC DNS service providers. But on the other hand, website operators are also impacted by fraud. So we need to adopt a nuanced approach when we discuss different scenarios, because different kind of issues may impact different sets of stakeholders. So we hope to resort to this multi-stakeholder approach, but we need to be mindful of the nuanced nature of this approach.
Quarters. Right. Any more questions? 有没有其他的问题? Okay. Because of the time, this will be the last question, please.
Thank you. Henry Chan from Nominet. I just want to make a, not necessarily a question, but a remark, probably around our private discussion around legislation and what does it mean to be in a multi-stakeholder model. I think one very key message from you is that there's going to be an active participation in for example, what do we do about DNS abuse and whatnot? I think the reality is, we've discussed before, the legislators are going to legislate because it's basically their job. And in the UK's perspective, in the House of Commons, we have seen a lot of discussion around online safety, digital economy, etc., etc. And I think one experience that we can share from Nominet's perspective is that we do have a very active and close relationship working with the UK government, and the law enforcement agency have access to us as a domain name registry, some rapid takedown, and we keep seeing from year by year, the data within the domain name registry and zones in Nominet. There's a significant improvement year by year in terms of the health of the namespace. So I think what I try to bring out is it takes everyone to actively engage with different stakeholders in the civil society, in government, to make sure we have done what needs to be done. And that actually echoed by the recent overwhelming support in the ICANN community with the DNS abuse amendment of the different agreements at ICANN level. So yeah, just want to leave it here, a little comment for everyone's sharing. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's a thank you for Nominate. And Nominate, maybe I can also promote. Nominate is also another CCTLD in UK, just like TWNIC is our peers. So I think it's very important. I think it's also, thank you for sharing. I think it's how we communicate and work, closely with, not only the governments, but also all the communities, stakeholders. I think it's very important because I think every stakeholders have their own domain knowledge. And I think they all hold some keys, to how to, respond or how to solve, the problems. So how we share, the domain knowledge, work together to tackle the challenge, I think is a really important thing. But I think another thing is that, because I remember that before I heard from Kenny that, sometimes there's a Gong You Tian theory is that, because, these public interest things, actually, it requires a lot of resources to participate and contribute. Actually, there's no payback sometimes, and it takes a long time. So, how to empower or encourage all the stakeholders to spend, think is a worthy, spending your time, and also to, encourage them to do so. I think it is another, a difficult question when we talk about the multi-stakeholder approach. Thank you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, can we please give Ms. Yu a big round of applause?
Thank you.
Thank you for bringing us to a closer view on the internet governance in Taiwan. Okay.